We are reading together a chapter a day. This book, Jesus is the Question, written by Martin Copenhaver. We're now on chapter 12, Questions from the Risen Christ. If ever there were a time when you might expect Jesus to stick with simple declarative sentences, it would be after his resurrection. While Jesus was alive, he could use questions to provoke or teach, but after his resurrection, certainly something else is called for then. Perhaps a simple declaration, I'm back, or something theological. I came back to show you that sin and death cannot defeat me. Or something reassuring, I love you and I always will. Or something whimsical, hey, you're not going to believe this. To be sure, the risen Jesus does offer his followers a few statements that are quite direct, such as, peace be with you, and I myself will be with you every day until the end of this present age. What is more striking, however, is that even when Jesus appears to his disciples after his death, he is still asking questions. I think that's because asking questions is so central to his life and teachings that they could not be abandoned even now. If Jesus did not ask questions after his resurrection, then he would be a different Jesus from the one who walked the earth. Besides, how could his followers be expected to know for sure that it is really Jesus, unless he is still asking questions? And if Jesus is going to ask questions on such a momentous day, you might expect he would have commensurately momentous questions to ask, probing questions, provocative questions. But some of the questions he asks after his resurrection are oddly commonplace. On this day of days, he asks everyday questions. After the crucifixion, two of Jesus' followers are walking away from Jerusalem on the road to Emmaus. When Jesus gets near the two, he simply asks them what they're talking about, a kind of matter-of-fact question you would ask good friends. It's the kind of question a boy might ask out of breath as he catches up with two friends walking home from school. Hey, what's up? What are you talking about? In another account, the risen Jesus stands on the beach, watching some of his disciples fishing from a boat. He asks, have you caught anything to eat? It's a question fishermen are used to hearing, particularly from those who have no experience with fishing. No fisherman I know would ask a question that way. It's just not done. Phrasing the question that way implies that success is up to the fisherman, which is particularly annoying when the answer is no, as it is in this case. So the preferred way to ask that question among fishermen is, any luck? But Jesus is a landlubber. How is he expected to know that? One question asked by the risen Jesus sounds just as mundane, but it is one of those questions that, upon further reflection, has far-reaching implications. According to Luke, soon after Jesus appears to his disciples, he asks, do you have anything to eat? That doesn't sound like the question of a risen Lord. It sounds more like the question of a teenager arriving home from school. Hey, I'm starving. What's there to eat? Jesus' disciples respond to his question in the only suitable way. They give him something to eat, a broiled fish, and he eats it. In a way, it's a hilarious scene. Apparently, this rising from the dead business really works up an appetite. Who knew? Get this fellow something to eat. But there's more to it. Eating in front of his disciples is a way to demonstrate that he is real. It isn't a ghost. Ghosts don't eat. It's a way of making clear that Jesus isn't a figment of his disciples' imaginations. The resurrection is not merely a psychological experience in the minds of his followers. It's Jesus in the midst of them again, in a way that was previously unknown and as unimaginable to them as it is to us. Some years ago, I read a book about children's views of God. The author interviewed dozens of English school children. As I recall, one child said something like, "I think God floats behind a cloud to eat sausages sometimes." That is a charming English school child way of saying that God is real. If you eat sausages sometimes, you're real. And I think Luke is saying much the same thing by describing Jesus eating broiled fish. He's real. In the case of Jesus, however, it means something more. It is a way of reaffirming that Jesus, even the resurrected Jesus, is not some divine being who is distant from human experience. After all, he can experience hunger. Even in his glorified state, he knows the very human experience of being hungry. Heard this way, the question, "Do you have anything to eat?" shows vulnerability. Picture the question on a makeshift cardboard sign held by a homeless man bundled against the cold. It is a plea born of vulnerability. Do you have anything to eat? The scriptural observation that man does not live on bread alone is undeniably true, but it is just as true that no one lives very long without it either. Jesus' need for food, even after he is raised, is a reminder that he still remains vulnerable. And notice what kind of food he served. You or I might not eat broiled fish all that often, but Jesus ate it all the time, particularly since he hung out with fishermen. So for him, broiled fish is the kind of comfort food associated with home. When our adult children come home after a time away, I often make fettuccine with my famous bolognese sauce. Okay, famous in our household, for just that reason. The aroma, the taste, the way it looks on the plate, the memory of all the times we have eaten it together. Every familiar dimension of the experience evokes home and homecoming. Food can do that. For my children, it is fettuccine with bolognese sauce. For Jesus, it's broiled fish. All of this talk about Jesus eating might lead you to a common misconception about the resurrection as it is described in the Gospels. The Gospel writers do not describe Jesus after the resurrection as having a resuscitated human body. Their accounts are more textured, more subtle than that. For instance, in some accounts, the risen Jesus suddenly appears and then disappears again as quickly as a thought. You might even conclude from those verses that Jesus is a spiritual presence more than a physical one, whatever that might look like. But then at other points, as when Jesus asks, "Do you have anything to eat?" it sounds like he appears in bodily form. Affirming both, somehow at the same time, is a way for the gospel writers to point to the mystery of what they proclaim. It is a way of presenting the striking truth to us who were not there to be struck by the experience. He lives, as surely as you or I live, yet in a different way all the same. After all, the gospel writers are trying to describe a reality that finally is indescribable, like trying to describe spring to those who have only known winter, or life itself to those who have never lived. So the language is not so much descriptive as it is evocative, chosen to evoke in us the same reaction that was surely theirs. It is as if the disciples and gospel writers are trying to describe music to those who are deaf. So they dance and hope we catch a small sense of what music is about. For a small sense is enough. It is as if they are trying to describe a sunset to those who are blind. So they say it's like a trumpet fanfare, and hope we catch a glimmer of the majesty and power of it. For a glimmer is still enough. Jesus' question, "Do you have anything to eat?" also points his disciples back to the promise he had made just a few days earlier. On that Thursday night, when Jesus gathered with his friends and disciples, he said, "I will be with you every time you gather at table." He wanted to give them something to do in remembrance, and what he chose was a simple meal, something his disciples had shared many times and would share many times after Jesus is gone. By choosing such an everyday event, Jesus was reminding them that he would be with them throughout their days, even the most mundane of Thursdays, through the most simple and common of activities. Of course, since that time, we've made a sacrament of it. We call it communion or the Eucharist. It's something we do at church, and of course, that's all fitting. But when Jesus first spoke the words, "Do this in remembrance of me," he was not referring to a sacrament. He was referring to a common meal. He was saying, in essence, every time you break bread together, I'll be there. These days, people sometimes talk about their spiritual lives or their spirituality. But when Jesus asks, "Do you have anything to eat?" it is a reminder that Jesus is not interested in our spiritual lives. He's interested in our whole lives, the lives we actually live. Jesus refuses to be confined to what we describe as spiritual. He is interested in the day-to-day living of our lives and shows up in the midst of the most common of human activities, like catching up with friends, as he did on the road to Emmaus, or like eating a broiled fish dinner. In his gospel, John also writes about the risen Jesus eating broiled fish, but in his story, Jesus is the chef. While the disciples are out fishing, Jesus builds a fire. When they come ashore, Jesus is already broiling some fish. This time, it is Jesus who invites his disciples to dig into some comfort food. He says, "Come and have breakfast." So the disciples sit and eat. When breakfast is almost over, Jesus turns to Peter and addresses him, "Simon, son of John." It is Peter's full name, the form of his name that Jesus only uses when he really means business. Then comes the question, and it is a question that sounds quite different from the inquiry about breakfast. "Do you love me more than these others do?" Is there any more vulnerable question than that? Jesus' question, "Do you have anything to eat?" is a question that reflects physical vulnerability. We all need food to survive, and apparently even the risen Jesus does as well. The question, "Do you love me?" reveals a different kind of vulnerability, an emotional vulnerability, because we all want to be loved, and apparently even the risen Jesus does as well. In a way, it is disquieting to hear this question from Jesus. It seems like an unwelcome role reversal. After all, isn't it Jesus' job to love us? In spite of our stumbling and our bumbling, even in the face of our fickle faith, Jesus is supposed to love us. Isn't that the essence of the good news? For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. When Jesus asks to be loved, it suggests a vulnerability that I'm not sure I want Jesus to have. does not make Jesus sound emotionally needy exactly, but it does imply that he has emotional needs. To suggest that Jesus might want love suggests that he might be very much like you or me, because we all want to be loved, which, of course, is just the point. Jesus is like us, vulnerable to the hurts of life, even now, after he is raised. When Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" he immediately responds, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And Jesus says, "Feed my lambs." Jesus asks the question a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter's response is the same, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus says, "Take care of my sheep." But Jesus just won't let this question go. He asks it yet a third time. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" By this time, Peter's feelings are hurt. He thinks that Jesus asks the question numerous times because he doubts Peter's devotion, and that bugs Peter. It's not hard to hear the irritation in his voice as he elaborates on his answer. "Lord, you know everything. You know I love you." Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." It's one of the only questions Jesus repeats, but why 3 times? After Jesus was arrested, Peter is among those huddled around a fire in the courtyard of the temple. 3 times Peter is asked if he knows Jesus, and 3 times he denies any association with him. So perhaps Jesus asks Peter for 3 expressions of love to give him a chance to redeem his 3 denials. There would at least be some symmetry to that. But there may be another reason Jesus repeats this question. In Greek, the original language of the New Testament, there is more than one word to describe love. One word is agape, which is unconditional love, the love that does not ask for anything in return, self-giving love, sacrificial love. It is the kind of love associated with Jesus. Followers of Jesus aim to reflect this kind of love in their interactions with one another, but as limited creatures, we seldom reflect true agape in our relationships. Another word in Greek that's translated as love is phileo, which is brotherly or sisterly love. It is the kind of love associated with friendships, warm and generous, but not completely unconditional. This form of love is more within our grasp. This distinction is important to understanding the exchange between Jesus and Peter. The first 2 times Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me?" he uses the word agape. And both times when Peter responds, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you," he is using the word phileo. In other words, Jesus asks Peter if he loves him with the kind of unconditional love associated with agape. But Peter is not able to respond in those terms. Peter may not be capable of agape yet, but he is able to love Jesus like a brother, like a true friend. Recognizing Peter's limitations, Jesus asks the question a 3rd time, but in a different way. This 3rd time, when Jesus asks, "Do you love me?" he is using the word phileo. And this time, Peter is able to respond in kind. "Yes, Lord, you know I love phileo, you." In other words, the 3rd time around, Jesus asks the question at Peter's level. Peter may not yet be capable of agape, of unconditional love, but he is capable of phileo, of loving Jesus like a brother and friend. So that is what Jesus asks of him. The 3rd time Jesus asks the question, he asks Peter for love in full measure, but for the kind of love of which Peter is capable. There are 3 questions that Jesus repeats in the Gospels. Those 3 questions, read together, capture so much about what it means to encounter Jesus. Jesus asks, "What are you looking for?" He asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" And he asks, "Do you love me?" What are you looking for is a question for those who yearn for God knows what, quite literally, and end up concluding that what they are yearning for is God. What do you want me to do for you is the question asked by a Lord who acts more like a servant, eager to tend to our needs. Do you love me is the question asked by someone who wants to be in relationship with you and is willing to become completely vulnerable in order to do so. If you want to grasp what a Christian life entails, repeat often these 3 questions and hold them close. That is the end of chapter 12.